This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to possibly the most closely associated movie with Christmas, It's a Wonderful Life, directed by Frank Capra, starring James Stewart, Donna Reed, and Lionel Barrymore. However, quickly before we get to the show, next week, as this is the last episode of Season 2, we will be doing our annual season recap of Season 2 and then looking forward to Season 3. You won't want to miss that one, so please make sure you are subscribed to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can still sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes, you can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Additionally, did you know that our website has the full notes for every episode of the show, as well as the master list of movies we've graded so far? There are links in the episode descriptions of every episode to direct you right there, so check them out. And as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. We would really appreciate it. All right, Dad, It's a Wonderful Life. We've been kind of leading up to this one for a while. This is the last of our Season 2. It is also the last of our holiday episodes. And we've been kind of discussing whether or not things are quote-unquote Christmas movies. We only had one holiday movie last year with Home Alone, and I'm sure we'll get to several more as we get into further seasons. But this one, I think, is something special for a certain group of people, and as I said on last week's episode, I think you have to be of a certain age to appreciate it. But this is one of your favorites, I think,
Yes.
if I could say as much. And I just want to give you our primary normal question to start off, because I think you mentioned it on the show a few episodes back, but what is your relationship to this movie?
When I was a young boy, my dad, who the studio is named after, used to talk to me about movies and things. And he used to talk about this film that he had only seen a few times. He had seen it in the theater when he was a boy and absolutely was enthralled by it. And he saw it a couple of times on TV in the 50s. And then it stopped showing. And he never saw it again for a long time. And he just kept talking about this film. And it was Jimmy Stewart. And until I was a teenager, my dad used to kind of stay up a little bit. He'd come home, he'd nap, and he'd kind of stay up a bit, and he'd watch TV until 11:30 Central Time. But he never watched Johnny Carson, except 2 times. One, when Buddy Hackett was on, and 2, when Jimmy Stewart was on. And then whenever Jimmy Stewart was on, somehow Carson always got him to talk about this film, and my dad would talk to me about this film again. And it wasn't until I was probably in freshman or sophomore in high school that all of a sudden the film started getting a wide release and started being shown on television again. And I saw it. And I remember my dad, there are probably about 3 times that I saw him cry in my entire life. When my mom died, when his dad died, and the first time we watched this film. I don't think he even cried when his own mother died.
Well, I think there's reason for that, but we don't need to go into family history.
Yeah. Anyway, so this film has held a very special place in the pantheon of the Duncan family film catalog. And so to that extent, it has always been one of my favorites. And every time I watch it, it not only makes an emotional connection to me, it brings a connection back to my dad that he was a man of very few words, sometimes no words. And so when you can draw a connection to somebody through something such as a film or an art or some aspect of art, it holds a very special meaning and place.
Granted. Now, as far as what you alluded to there, that this became much more of a wide release or widely known film in about the mid 70s, I did come across this and I didn't put it in our Did You Know section. This is just some of my advanced research. Apparently, what happened is they had two different copyrights for the film. One was for the subject material for the story, The Greatest Gift, that this is based upon. The second was for the movie itself. There was apparently an error in filing in 1975 or something like that, and it became part of the public domain after that. And so thus they allowed this film basically to be seen by anybody. So it was cheap because they only had to pay royalties on the subject material to the studio, or the studio was absorbed by, I can't remember who the parent company was at that point. Maybe it was like MGM or something.
I believe so.
But they only had to pay a small royalty fee in order to be able to show this. So they started, like The Wizard of Oz, playing this every Christmas. And that's why it's so widely associated, because all the major broadcast networks could use and produce this movie for Christmas. So beginning with about 1976 until about 1993, when there was a further court battle over the copyrights and some other things that went on, you had a basically widely released film, so roughly 20 some years, where it could be seen almost every year on Christmas. And I think that's why the connection is there. But it would basically disappeared from about the early 50s when it kind of got out of the public cycle into the 70s when it started being part of the public domain.
Yeah, and we talked about that when we did Hitchcock Month and how Hitchcock had bought several of his films because no one envisioned residuals or reruns or multiple television stations broadcasting. Nobody thought about content. They just assumed, for example, that when the show was done, it was done. In fact, I always talk about one of my dad's favorites was Ernie Kovacs. Ernie Kovacs' widow had to sue and I want to say it was NBC, because all of his shows were recorded, but they just dumped them in at the time, New York had a dump, which was basically on the East River. So you just dump the stuff into the East River. And a ton of his shows were just destroyed that way. She sued in order to get control of them because of that. So that's what we're talking about. That there was this whole period of the 50s and 60s where they didn't preserve this stuff.
Something that may be of interest to you was actually what helped them get the rights back, or the copyright back, was actually a different case, and I can't remember the specific name. Is Stewart v. something, and it was James Stewart actually suing over the property rights to Rear Window.
Okay, I can see that.
So I thought that might be of eventual interest to you. But I think we're going to have a lot of other things to discuss, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. And even our question of whether or not this is a Christmas movie, I think I have a point in favor of one side or the other on this one. So before we get too far, do you have a plot summary ready for us?
I do. George Bailey, played by James Stewart, grows up in the town of Bedford Falls, New York, and has spent a lifetime in the service of others, putting his family, his friends, and his community above himself and his dreams of seeing the world and doing things that are big. On Christmas Eve, Uncle Billy, Thomas Mitchell, mistakenly loses $8,000, leaving a shortage in the building and loan accounts that they run. Being at his wits' end, George asks for help from his nemesis and the town villain, Mr. Potter, Lionel Barrymore, who not only refuses to help, but swears out a warrant for his arrest for theft. Contemplating suicide, George is visited by Clarence, Henry Travers, a guardian angel who has yet to win his wings. To convince George that his life matters, Clarence grants George his wish that he had never been born. As George experiences a world devoid of him, will he learn his true value and what his years of self-sacrifice really meant?
Thank you. Cast for this movie: James Stewart as George Bailey, Donna Reed as Mary Hatch, Lionel Barrymore as Mr. Potter, Thomas Mitchell as Uncle Billy, Henry Travers as Clarence, Beulah Bondi as Mrs. Bailey, Frank Phelan as Ernie, Ward Bond as Bert, and Gloria Graham as Violet Beck. Recognition for this movie. In 1947, It's a Wonderful Life was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Director for Frank Capra, Actor for James Stewart, Editing and Sound Recording. It won a Technical Achievement Award for the development of a new simulating falling snow on motion picture sets. More on that in a moment. Upon initial release, the film recorded a loss of $525,000 at the box office for RKO. In 2002, Channel 4 in the United Kingdom ranked It's a Wonderful Life as the 7th greatest film ever made in its poll 100 Greatest Films. The network airs the film to British viewers annually on Christmas Eve. In June 2008, AFI revealed its 10 Top 10, the best 10 films in 10 classic American film genres, after polling over 1,500 people from the creative community. It's a Wonderful Life was acknowledged as the 3rd best film in the fantasy genre. In 1990, It's a Wonderful Life was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. Did you know? The film's elevation to the status of a beloved Christmas classic came 3 decades after its initial release, when it became a television staple during Christmas season in 1976. This came as a welcome surprise to Frank Capra and others involved with its production. Quote, "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen," Capra told the Wall Street Journal in '84. "The film has a life of its own now, and I can look at it like I had nothing to do with it. I'm like a parent whose kid grows up to be president. I'm proud, but it's the kid who did the work. I didn't even think of it as a Christmas story when I first ran across it. I just liked the idea." Is it a Christmas movie? Did you know? It is commonly believed that the characters of Bert and Ernie on Sesame Street were named after Bert the cop and Ernie the cab driver, a tale I've been told for years. However, in a correction for the 1999 annual Christmas quiz in the San Francisco Chronicle, which made this claim, series writer Jerry Jewell confirmed that, per producer John Stone, the shared names were merely a coincidence. Despite this, the 1996 holiday special Elmo Saves Christmas references the rumor during a scene where Bert and Ernie walk by a TV set which is playing the movie. The pair are surprised by the line, "Bert, Ernie, what's the matter with you two guys? You were here on my wedding night." Did you know? On May 26, 1947, the Federal Bureau of Investigation issued a memo stating, quote, "With regard to the picture It's a Wonderful Life, redacted, stated in substance that the film represented rather obvious attempts to discredit bankers by casting Lionel Barrymore as a Scrooge type so that he would be the most hated man in the picture. This, according to these sources, is a common trick used by communists. In addition, redacted stated that, in his opinion, this picture deliberately maligned the upper class, attempting to show that people who had money were mean and despicable characters." Did you know? For the scene that required Donna Reed to throw a rock through the window of the Granville house, director Frank Capra hired a marksman to shoot it out on cue. To everyone's amazement, however, Reed broke the window by herself. She had played baseball in high school and had a strong throwing arm. Did you know? As Uncle Billy drunkenly leaves the Bailey home, it sounds as if he stumbles into some trash cans on the sidewalk. In fact, a crew member dropped a large tray of props right after Thomas Mitchell went off screen. James Stewart began laughing, and Mitchell quickly improvised, "I'm all right, I'm all right." Director Frank Capra decided to use this take in the final cut and gave the stagehand a $10 bonus for, quote, "improving the sound." Did you know? The gym floor that opens in the middle to reveal the swimming pool underneath was filmed at Beverly Hills High School in Beverly Hills, California, and is real, and is still in regular use. The same gymnasium moving floor was used in a similar school dance scene in Whatever It Takes, a movie from 2000, 54 years later. Did you know? Films made prior to this one used cornflakes painted white for the falling snow effect. Because the cornflakes were so loud, dialogue had to be dubbed in later. Director Frank Capra wanted to record the sound live, so a new snow effect was developed using fomite, a firefighting chemical, soap, and water. This mixture was then pumped at high pressure through a wind machine to create the silent falling snow. 6,000 gallons of the new snow were used in the film. The RKO Effects Department received a Class 3 Scientific or Technical Award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Academy Award aka Oscar Award, for the development of the new film Snow. Did you know? Sam makes a fortune in plastics while Harry becomes an engineer at his father-in-law's glass factory. Both of these come out of Frank Capra's own education in chemical engineering. Capra himself was unable to find a job with his background and, like George Bailey, considered himself a failure for many years. Did you know? The Martinis are based on director Frank Capra's own family, who emigrated from Sicily in 1903. In the movie, a goat accompanies them in the car. Capra actually means goat in Italian. Let's take a quick break before we get to the rest of the show. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. So, Dad, what is this movie about, or what would be the elevator pitch?
A man realizes what the value of his life was.
I'm going to use a common idiom for this one. You never know what you've got till it's gone. I tried to make it much more complicated, and then I'm like, no, I think by itself, if you just do that, it's simple enough people understand exactly what this is about, because people don't need us to pitch this movie. They probably know the plot line by heart at this point. So, best performance for you?
Oh, hands down, James Stewart. He exhibited such a wide range of emotions and was so likable throughout the film. About a year and a half ago, World War II magazine, which I have a subscription to, had an entire piece on James Stewart and the fact he flew 50 missions. He's one of the, it's like 1 in 10 men who actually flew 50 missions and survived. And he was going through such post-traumatic stress following World War II that making this film, he was constantly battling depression and nightmares and anxiety and such. And then when you think about it in that context, and to achieve the performance he did, really kind of shows the range, ability, and merit of this actor. He was able to really, I think to some extent, even by what I've been reading from interviews and things he did, use this film more or less as a healing experience. So it's not just him acting, it's him living through the character to achieve a certain return to normalcy that he needed following the war.
I follow you. I think this particular movie requires us to discuss two people primarily, Stewart being one of them. I didn't nominate him as my best performer. I nominated him as my best secondary performer. But I think very easily it could be 1A and 1B. I think that this is probably his broadest range as an actor. I don't know if I would say it's necessarily his best performance of any in any film, but I think you could very easily make an argument that it is. It's very difficult to take somebody and over the course of 2 hours have to go from a childlike exuberance to someone forced into certain life situations to playing a kicked dog essentially to being completely out of your mind, downtrodden, and contemplating suicide, to then complete exuberance. I mean, the swings emotionally through the course of this movie are made by his almost facial expressions. The reason that I really, and I see it coming, I enjoy the first probably 2/3 of this movie. The minute we get to about the Uncle Billy scene, I just like dread that part of the movie because I know what is coming. Even though I enjoy the exuberance in that last part of the movie, it's just so emotionally depressing to see what he's going through because he does such a great job being able to convince you of this man's problems and make them relatable.
You point out a very significant point, which is, I mean, the scene with Uncle Billy where he's, oh, you stupid fool. One of us is going to, you know what this means, bankruptcy and scandal and prison. And one of us is going to prison and it's not going to be me. but you just know immediately that he will take on the responsibility, and that's what's going to happen. And you
I guess I
cringe
never
for
thought
him
of that, but sure, okay.
because that's all he's ever done.
Yeah.
Because it's wired into him that he is going to take on the responsibility. And I'll readily admit, listeners don't know everything about me, but I mean, I've spent most of my adult life either serving on the school board or the village board or a church council, and to some extent I relate to George Bailey because I feel like I'm wired to just take on responsibilities, and sometimes they're crushing and you can feel it. And I guess this is one of the reasons why this movie is so emotional to me, because I can just see myself in those situations of taking on the responsibility and just absolutely going, oh my gosh, I actually took all this on and now it's crushing me and I don't know what to do.
So let me make a slight transition to my own best performance nominee here. And let me ask you two just small questions. Who would you say at this point was arguably the biggest star in Hollywood? And what was the biggest film genre?
In 1946,
Yeah, roughly.
boy, that would be difficult.
Maybe not quite 46, but I'm thinking along those lines. So where I'm going with this is I would say that it's probably the Western, and it's
Yes.
probably somebody like a John Wayne.
Okay, maybe Errol
I don't
Flynn,
think he
maybe in
quite
that
got to
time
his
frame.
peak levels until he got into the 50s. But the reason I mentioned that is the protagonist in George Bailey is in complete stark contrast to every Western protagonist we've ever had. He is self sacrificing, he is acquiescent, he
Yeah,
is almost perceived as weak, he is all about service and about altruism, whereas every Western character almost takes on the persona of I'm going to go get the bad guy and it's all on my shoulders. And I'm going to take every action as selfishly as possible because that's the only way to survive in a crude dog eat dog world. And for you to write such an engaging protagonist in an era, well, and frankly, we've never completely gotten out of that era, that is so anti the normal heroic character. Even to a certain extent, the anti hero character is molded in that same world or fashion. And to make it resonate with people, I think is an incredibly difficult idea. And so I went instead, even though he was not the primary screenwriter, with Capra, because ultimately I think this is his movie. He does something that I don't think you saw in a lot of other Hollywood directors of the time. Each one of them has a certain flair, and I've seen let's see here. I've seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I've seen this movie. I've seen It Happened One Night, and I've seen what was the family one from '37 that won Best Picture? You Can't Take It With You. All four are Capra movies. Two of them won Best Picture. All four of them were nominated for Best Picture, and they all have a certain sentimentality and optimism to them. I don't think this movie is the same if somebody like John Ford is directing it. I think there would be a certain level of cynicism that would be baked into it. Or even for that matter, somebody like a George Stevens or a Billy Wilder. Even though William Wyler had a similar type film this year, or the same year that won Best Picture, The Best Years of Our Lives, which we've already covered, and I would recommend people go back to listen to that one. It just doesn't have the same chipper, optimistic, almost sugary tone to it. You can see a lot of the Capra nicety through each one of his films. There's a bubbling almost idealism about every one of his films that I don't think you get in a lot of Hollywood productions. Something similar to me that has a certain level of optimistic idealism is kind of the way that I look at a show like The West Wing used to be. that's kind of got some of the same stuff, but it's not quite as syrupy as Capra movies. And this whole movie is defined by that tone that even in our darkest moments, you can have an exuberance because all of the people that you've touched directly are better benefited by your presence being there. It never shows you really the negative side or how people would be better off if you weren't there. Because it's possible that there are different factors that you maybe not have considered. Or it doesn't even extend the net wide enough to say what are all the indirect effects of everything that happened if you were not there. I mean, it kind of goes through a few of them, but for the most part, it just focuses on the direct links that are to George Bailey and the town and his family and everybody else, as opposed to anything closer. So, with that in mind, creating a unusual protagonist that I think is relatable, creating a story that is unlike any other, with a tone that is definite and I think is what sets this movie apart. I give it to Capra as my best performer.
Very interesting. I can't disagree on any of your points. I think this is the culmination of Capra.
I think so too. I think it's his pinnacle film.
Yeah. We've watched, I think, together most of his works in the 30s before he went into the war, and I watched his documentaries, Why We Fight, done for the War Department.
I think the only one we didn't watch together was It Happened One Night. I think I watched that on my own, but the other ones I remember showing with you.
I can understand, and I thought about it, but actually I was going to throw out that I wanted to give a unique award to Capra simply because Capra created something bigger than himself. This film is not just Capra. It is not Stewart. It is not Lionel Barrymore. It is not Donna Reed. It is not Henry Travers. This film is, you can combine those individuals by themselves. This is a situation where a group of people come together and create something that becomes bigger than their individual selves.
So it's transcendent, more or less.
Correct.
So then where did you go with best secondary performer?
Simply because every time I've seen him do anything, he was just so phenomenal. I went with Lionel Barrymore. He doesn't make Potter into a cartoon. It would be so easy for him to be the nasty, bitter old man on everything. But there's a certain aspect of him that's believable. That it's not so over the top you just like automatically hate him. You hate him, but you understand where he's coming from and you can kind of understand his thought process, but it's kind of the summary or the pinnacle of a group of people that we've had throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, the robber baron types that were more interested in the money aspect.
I wouldn't even limit it that far. Let's do this. I thought of this today, but while I was putting my notes together, I think you should try a social experiment. So you have your Thursday morning Bible study, and I don't know who still goes to that, but I guarantee you every one of them has at least seen the film once. Ask them who they relate to most, George Bailey or Mr. Potter. And if they say George Bailey, ask who they voted for in the last election. Because the real answer of this is that Mr. Potter is exactly what we have come to be defined what is supposedly great about America over the last 40 years.
I can see it.
That's why I think that the note that I had earlier about the FBI saying this was all stuff used by communists, I think is somewhat funny because this is exactly the same talking points we've been in for political fights for years.
Yeah, when Mr. Potter uses the term a rabble instead of a thrifty working class.
So I just think that this is funny how this movie has taken over the American consciousness despite its anti American values. Anyway, back to Lionel Barrymore. Yeah, he's in at least two other. I don't think he's in It Happened One Night, but I know he was in both. You Can't Take It With You, and oh no, I guess he isn't in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I was thinking of Grand Hotel, but he's certainly in You Can't Take It With You, and even in Grand Hotel, he's a much more jovial, likable, kind of like that old grandpa type that you kind of just like and enjoy. And yet he's clearly defined by this character because this is the most famous role of his.
Well, other than Dr. Kildare, where he was Dr. Gillespie in the 50s on television.
Okay, I didn't know he was, but
Yeah, I'm pulling that one out of my rear end because you have no idea what I'm talking about.
the only thing I can think of right now is the Dr. Gillespie killings from Blazing Saddles.
So yeah, no, it's Dr. Kildare was a hugely popular show with Richard Chamberlain as Dr. Kildare, and Lionel Barrymore was like the head of the hospital, and all he did was snort and wheel down the hall yelling, kind of like Mr. Potter. I've seen the show in reruns. Obviously, I'm not that old, although at times I feel that old.
And you date yourself.
Yeah, I know. I actually think I'm at least a generation off. I should have been in the greatest generation because I can see myself in that generation. But anyway.
Humble brag much?
No, it's not bragging. It's just I can see myself going off and doing something in the war. I can see myself coming back and being in the 50s and enjoying, that aspect of entertainment and such. But anyway, Lionel Barrymore, there was just something about him that he had a presence. He just had an ability to act, even though he physically, because of what was believed to be advanced rheumatoid arthritis, could not walk. Really, he really was in a wheelchair. Just had a knack for being able to play parts and to do so with very minimal physical abilities.
Yeah, he really creates an idyllic character in Mr. Potter, and I think for reasons that are easily attributable, I do think there are a lot of people that can relate to Mr. Potter, and even so, I do think that he creates this performance well beyond what you would get in a normal antagonist, and really sets the stage because in order for the protagonist to have the greatest level of catharsis, he has to have an equally great villain. And I think Barrymore in that role is equal to the weight of Jimmy Stewart at his best. So then, most charismatic, I went with somebody who, even though I find him generally unlikable in every other performance I've seen of him, because primarily he's playing a drunk or somebody who's shady, like in Stagecoach, Thomas Mitchell as Uncle Billy is my most charismatic. Only because a certain someone in my life has been repeating for years, I'm all right, I'm all right.
Yes, I know.
Everything down from the little strings on his finger to losing the money to being a complete bumbling fool all over himself. He is my most charismatic.
Oh, yeah, I can understand. And as listeners generally know, I have a tendency in films I love to fall in love with the leading lady. And every time I watch this film, I fall in love with Donna Reed. I just have an emotional connection. And I mean, if she and I were the same age, I would be wanting to run off with Donna Reed because I just absolutely adore her. And even in films where she was not as likable of a character, which I think a film that we will be getting to with Frank Sinatra at some point in time.
From Here to Eternity?
Here to Eternity. She's a prostitute in From Here to Eternity.
That's her?
Yes.
Oh.
She's the love interest of Montgomery Clift in From Here to Eternity. She plays a prostitute, but even then I'm in love with her. Just something about her. Or the way she smiles, the way she presents herself. I just love her, and I think she an ability to on screen to convey a likable, lovable person, somebody that you want to spend the rest of your life with.
All right, let's move to best scene then. I only have, oddly enough, for a scene, or excuse me, for a movie that has 2.5, or no, excuse me, 2.25 hours, and I would say probably a numerous amounts of scenes, I really only picked out a few, or a good handful here to kind of nominate. And I stretched it a little bit in order to kind of get to this many. I would just say there are certain moments in the film that just are above the others, and a lot of it's filler. But first for me, Mr. Gower,
Yes.
the next one, Graduation Dance. I think that one's kind of a long and complicated scene, but you kind of get the gist of that one. George Lasso's The Moon, Run on the Bank, Clarence Saves George, Pottersville, which I'll use as code word for basically when George goes to the place where he's not born, George Pleading to Live Again, and then The Town Saving George, which
Yes.
I think you could probably combine, but I'm going to make two separate things for a moment. So any that I missed?
Not really. By the way, the dance, Donna Reed's date that night. If you recognize him, you've watched the Little Rascals films from the 30s, because the actor who was playing her date in this had been Alfalfa in Little Rascals.
Well, let's just say I haven't, and I didn't.
Okay,
So then, best scene.
to me, and it's also my most memorable, is the climax, the culmination where the town comes in. I have seen this film probably 20 times, 25 times. It's to the point where your mother used to get mad at me because I would start reciting the lines about 5 seconds before the actors did. And she would get so mad that I was ruining the film. But every time that scene comes up, and it happened again on Sunday while I was watching it, I cry. I just can't help it because it's just such a beautiful moment where you realize that what you have done has actually had some value. And if you've ever had that experience in life, I think you really appreciate it more. I just remember when my dad passed away, I had friends from all over showing up at his funeral who never knew my dad but were there for me. And I felt so honored that the people that I had helped, or that I felt I'd helped impact their lives, were coming to support me at that moment. And I always think of that every time I see that scene. So it's just special to me. My words only go so far. I have difficulty. I wish I was more of a poet. I always wanted to be more of a poet, but I have a difficult time articulating my emotions sometimes. But I find very little more beautiful than that.
I would second your statement down to the letter. I also had a problem. I don't know if I, at times I've openly sobbed at that moment. I don't think this was one of them, but I cried or teared up at least at three different points in the movie. And this was probably the most profound because it is a wellspring of emotion. It's touching because you find yourself in the place of George and you want to think that your life mattered. I think at a certain point in time, particularly the older you get, you want to believe that what you've done has made an effect, even though you can't see the residuals very easily. I think that's why Clarence describes it as one of the great gifts of life, to see what the world would be like if you weren't in it, and to see how many people are touched directly, and I really do think indirectly, by your just mere presence in it, your personality, your life force. It's hard for me to remember back to the first time seeing this movie, but if I were somebody that was completely fresh coming into this movie, the way that that is presented, where Mary just comes back in and you really don't expect the town to come to his aid. He's fully expecting to be sent off to prison. Like, he's basically extending his arms out to be handcuffed by the inspectors and I don't know if that's the sheriff or the warden or whomever is there to arrest him. And he doesn't care because realistically, everybody's better because he was there to begin with. And then you get that on top of it. And I think the climax of even that is the final inscription on the book nobody is a failure who has friends. And I think that's the part that always just hammers home that much more of the emotional side of it for me. I think it's by far the best scene because it's meant to be the best scene. I think the way you start and finish this movie is very telling. You start it very slowly and it kind of builds and it builds until you hit this emotional climax. And Capra does a good job of knowing exactly that this has to be the ending. Don't hang out there. Don't try and fit more in. Don't try and just dovetail it at the end. No, cap it off and just let it sit with you so that as the audience comes out from the movie and when they're all singing Auld Lang Syne, a song I still have no idea what the fuck it means. It's just this absolute tearjerker because they're recognizing him and his life's accomplishments, which you've just seen for 2+ hours. It is both my best scene and my most indelible.
Mine too. Unless, of course, you watch the Saturday Night Live version of the last final scene from It's a Wonderful Life, where Dana Carvey is James Stewart and Phil Hartman is Uncle Billy, and Uncle Billy remembers that he gave the $8,000 to Mr. Potter, and the whole town goes and beats the shit out of him. It's on YouTube. I encourage everybody to watch it because it's a good chuckle. Because it's exactly remaining questions. That's the remaining question. Why does nobody figure this out?
Well, that was actually one of mine, so you kind of stole that. But essentially,
Yeah.
why Mr. Potter, like, what does he do with the money? Just takes the $8,000 and nobody knows any differently?
Yeah.
So, anyway. Favorite scene, though, I think is the only thing we have left. Mine is the run on the bank, which I don't think would be almost anybody else's favorite scene. But I think it's the one time that the building alone is truly in jeopardy. And realistically, through some convincing and some resources, George is able to keep everything afloat simply by him being him. And I thought it was one of the better heroic moments in the movie, despite everything else that's going on, because it's the one where he just kind of did it on his own. And you see what his true effect can be on the town when they're all afraid and he becomes their emotional leader.
For me, it's kind of an odd one. It's the scene at Harry's homecoming and engagement party leading up to Donna Reed and the phone call from Sam Wainwright. That whole string, because I can relate to that. You know, when I was a young man and I was in college and then starting law school, I had this agenda of things I was going to accomplish and how I was going to basically rule the world. And all of a sudden, I realized how shallow everything was. And it wasn't something I necessarily thought about, but I'm like, I don't want to go through this by myself. And you can see George's struggle. He himself understands that he doesn't want to be alone, but in order to take away some of his dreams, he has to forego those for the purpose of a family and a relationship, a wife. The singer Kenny Rogers years ago said something that I thought was really profound, which is the opposite of loss of spontaneity, or the antithesis of spontaneity, is responsibility. And I thought about that, and that is that instead of doing what you want to do, you realize that there are things you have to do. And I just simply always relate to George, having gone through that as a young man and realizing that there are certain things that are necessary in order to have a certain quality of life, that it's not necessarily about what you want to achieve.
Well, this is another good spot to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. All right, Dad, before we get to best funniest lines, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Fortunately, we only have one. Anne Rice, who is a American writer who did the Vampire Diaries, which were turned into films. passed this way. I think she was 80. Complications secondary to a stroke. A lot of people think that the Vampire Diaries launched the career of Brad Pitt and helped cement Tom Cruise as a leading man as he reached a more mature age.
You might want a small correction. It's the Vampire Chronicles.
That's what I said.
No, you said the Diaries on two
Oh,
separate occasions.
excuse me.
That's a TV show that is slightly different.
Yeah. Okay. My mistake. Vampire Chronicles.
Yes, but the primary book in that one, Interview with a Vampire, was adapted to a film, I think, that you made reference to there. So
Yes.
we recognize her for her work and contribution to both entertainment and literature, and give her a moment of silence here. Thank you. All right, let's get to best funniest lines. First one up for me, because this one has been broadcast in our house and misquoted for years. House owner: "Oh, youth is wasted on the wrong people."
How old are you anyway? 18. 18? Why, you were only last year, you were 17.
You don't really do a great Jimmy Stewart there.
No, I don't.
Zuzu: "Teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings."
Annie, I've been saving this money for a divorce if ever I get a husband.
Clarence to George: "Strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. When he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he?"
George Bailey, my mouth's bleeding. Bert, my mouth's bleeding.
Good, you left this one for me then. "Hey, Merry Christmas, Mr. Potter, and a Happy New Year to you in jail."
Yeah. Who's down there with you, Mary? It's George Bailey, Mother. George Bailey? What does he want? I don't know. What do you want? Nothing. I just came in to get warm, is all. He's making violent love to me, Mother.
Clarence: "In the book inscription, remember, George, no man is a failure who has friends."
George Bailey. Merry Christmas, movie house! Merry Christmas, Emporium! Merry Christmas, you old wonderful building and loan!
What the fuck was that? You sounded like a Muppet.
Which one?
I don't even know. I think it's a new one.
Then how can I sound like a Muppet that doesn't
It
exist?
just sounds such like a... I don't even know.
Alright, whatever.
You got any more? Otherwise, I'm done.
Oh, Uncle Billy. After all, Potter, some people like George had to stay home. Not every heel was in Germany. Excuse me. That's what's written here. It's wrong. After all, Potter, some people like George had to stay home. Not every hero was in Germany and Japan.
No, they had it right. That's the line. It's heel.
Heel?
Heel.
Why?
Because he's talking to Potter. George Bailey is staying at home to fight Potter. That's why the line is written that way.
Not every heel?
Correct. Meaning that not all villains like Hitler were in Germany. He's basically making a burn on Potter.
I see. That's not, I guess I never thought of it that way, but okay.
That's the line. All right, let's go to the Stanley rubric. Legacy is up. Do you want to lead all of these? I mean, this movie's more important to you than it is to me.
Okay, legacy. Industry. I mean, it is constantly talked about. It is considered one of the best. It is a favorite of a lot of people. It is an annual classic. It is. 5 for both. I give it a 10.
All right. I think you're pretty spot on most of this. I think from an industry standpoint, given that wasn't this Capra's basically last movie, he basically retired due to thinking that this movie was an absolute flop and failure. I think this has a somewhat complicated history for the length of its time, and really only many decades after the fact became a popular film. I do think that industry wise, it's not necessarily as appreciated sometimes as some other ones. While it's stated as being one of the great films, I don't think it's ever really in that top tier or echelon of the greatest. So I'm going to give it a fraction off for that. I'm going to go 4.5 on that one. And for the audience, I think I said it last week. I said it earlier on this point of the podcast, or excuse me, when we first started up. But I think you have to be of a certain age to appreciate this one. And while a lot of people have watched this for Christmas for years and have an appreciation and a fondness, I do think there is a certain portion of the population, like myself, who are kind of annoyed by the movie until maybe they reach a certain age, or there are just certain people that are kind of turned off by the movie. I don't think it's a matter of people haven't seen it or that it's waned or something, but I just don't see that this is a completely universally fond movie. So I also gave it a half point off for that one. I ended at a 9. Impact significance. Oh, excuse me. The average then is a 9.5.
Did get multiple Academy Award nominations. A lot of critics liked it. There were some, a lesser amount, that deadpanned it as being too syrupy and sweet. It did not draw as well in the box office as it could. So I went with a 4.5 for industry and a 3.5 for the box office. So 8.
This is where our scores are going to significantly differ. So while it did garner Academy Awards, it lost all 5 and was not really in the conversation for winning any of the awards. This was kind of a under the radar film for that year, even in the critic circles. And while some people gave it generally positive reviews, it wasn't like they were glowing or anybody had like high praise for the movie. It was kind of, all right, this is a fine film. We understand it. This is, decent in kind of that range. And then the people who hated it really hated it. So I gave it kind of a 3 for the industry side of it because I do think that you have to give it some credit for the weight of this. But I think that for the stir that it caused with how big of a flop it was seen of at the time within the industry, as well as the fact that it lost $500,000 in an era where $500,000 is a significant amount of money. I mean, even now, if you lost $500,000 on a movie, I think everybody would basically be deadpanning that as one of the worst movies of all time, not a genuine classic. I gave it a 0.5 for audience. I ended at a 3.5.
Wow. Okay.
Again, this movie did not have a life for it until almost 30 years later. That's 5.75 is the average between us. Novelty.
How it was structured, the concepts, the angel, the fantasy aspect of it, I thought was very original. It's not like it had never been done before or the certain aspects of it. So I went with an 8.5 because I don't think it is right on point, but I don't think it's much lower than that. So just kind of played around and thought about it, and that's where I went with.
I think this is the original alternate reality fantasy thing by which everything else is measured. I think to a certain extent that you have everybody playing off of the formula that was created by this. So I have to give that a certain weight to this as well. But I think one of the other key differences to this movie is a subject that was not often discussed and really only in the last, I think, 10, 15, 20 years has been a major topic of conversation and study that this movie has a key element toward suicide. I don't think that a Christmas classic that is supposed to be full hearted and warm and evoking family and community and togetherness is normally going to discuss suicide and make it somehow a olive branch toward a very difficult topic. So for me, as a novelty standpoint, and just on the suicide angle alone, I'll give it some extra points. I went 9.5.
Okay.
So averages out to a 9. Classicness.
The female roles were reflective of the times. Absolutely no diversity except one African American character
Who
who's
happened to be in the
kind of,
service role.
yeah, and almost cartoonish.
She was basically the mammy of the film.
Yeah. So those two aspects knocked it down a point each for me. But for the rest of it, I mean, well, I take that back. I'll go another half point because the scene where George grabs Mary and starts shaking her. I don't want to get married. I want to do what I want to do. You don't do that. That has always bothered me. And so I gave it a half point down for that. So I'm at a 7.5.
I'm not too much different, but I arrive at it from different reasons. I tend to have a slightly different curve when grading older films, unless it's egregious. I think all of the small things in this are just stuff that was expected. I mean, how many other films from the 40s and 50s that we've done have a diverse cast? I mean, we didn't really start seeing diverse casts until, I don't know, maybe Cleavon Little in Blazing Saddles. I mean, that's about where we're at. So I I don't know. I can't give it too much. It's not like it was Gone with the Wind, but just pausing on that form of it for me. I think my biggest issue with this movie and why I ended up at an 8 is that we live in a more Pottersville like world where the we've been taught that capitalism rewards those that are business hungry, that focus only on the making money portion of it, that we shouldn't be giving out charity or breaks to people that don't deserve it, and everybody should be standing on their own 2 feet. And this whole movie is antithetical to that proposition. And so, if the American dream is based on what can I do to make myself rich, you shouldn't be relating to George Bailey. It's an anti-American political value movie. And I'm sure not many people have ever put it that way or thought about it in that angle. So I ended up at an 8.
Okay.
So that's a 7.75 between us. Rewatchability.
You always criticize me for this category.
I
So I'm
do.
just going to do it, which is I'll watch this film every year, no matter what. And if it comes on some other time of the year, I'll probably sit and watch a few minutes of it if I find it. So I'm giving it a 10.
I didn't know I criticized you that much over it, but okay.
Well, you've always said, I don't know why you never want to give a film a 10. Okay, this is a 10.
Okay. This is hard for me to stomach more than once a year, despite my slightly increasing fondness over time for the movie. I just have a hard time watching probably the second half or the last third of this movie. It just has always been the case for me because I don't want to go into that weird alternate universe thing. Even as good as the climax is, it's just such an emotional roller coaster to get there. And it always is the detracting part of the film for me. If it was just the life story portion of it, sure. But you can't get to that ending without the major emotional catharsis. And it's just not something I look forward to putting myself through year after year after year. So I have no problem with watching this occasionally, but once a year is more than fine enough for me. I'll go with 6.5. So that's an 8.25 between us. So to recap, we had a 9.5 for legacy, we had a 5.75 for impact significance, we had a 9 for novelty, 7.75 for classicness, 8.25 for rewatchability, and in audience score, we had a 92% from Google users and a 95% from Rotten Tomato users for a 9.35 overall, which adds up to 49.6 total points. And that would currently place it between Whiplash and Sunset Boulevard on the list.
Not not a stretch either way. I mean that I kind of agree with that.
Well, I think, and this is where the categories have grown over the years, is that the impact significance when something comes out, I think is usually and rewatchability are two of the biggest factors that weigh certain pictures down. I think that's why certain Steven Spielberg movies have been as high as they are, because they were as big in the moment as they are in their legacy. And it's really a hard trick for a lot of other movies to follow. We've seen a lot of ones where the legacy expands over time, much like this movie, or for that matter, The Wizard of Oz, which don't quite get up into the annals of the top films overall as a result of that impact significance category.
Yeah.
All right, remaining questions. We already got one of them, but what did Potter do with the money, and does Uncle Billy ever remember? I think that's the question everybody's been asking themselves
Yeah.
for 70 years.
Yeah.
2 for me. How does the bank examiner just let George and Billy walk away since he knows the replacement money clearly didn't come from the bank?
Yeah.
He watches everybody comes in. He even adds to the pile. And I know this is 1946 and you could get away with a lot more, but I just don't understand that one. Anyway, any remaining questions for you?
No, a couple of comments I wanted to make because I did a little extra research and I wanted to add it to the end here. A couple of things. A couple of years ago, you and your sisters gave me for Christmas a biography by Scott Iman, Hank and Jim. It's the story of two buddies, Henry Fonda and James Stewart. And I happened to go and look up It's a Wonderful Life. Lou Wasserman, who was Stewart's agent, negotiated the first contract in Hollywood where Stewart got for It's a Wonderful Life 10% of the gross, not of the net, but of the gross. And more than equaled the amount of money they paid him as a salary for the film. And then also, of course, as I mentioned, Stewart was struggling with PTSD. And Capra asked Lionel Barrymore to help Stewart through it. And Barrymore spent a lot of time talking to Stewart and working him through and understanding that you don't have to apologize for the fact that you were out of Hollywood for the last 4 years. And you don't have to act as if you're no longer able to act because you've experienced the horrors of war and such. And Stewart spent most of his life very grateful to Barrymore for helping him put things in perspective, that there was not going to be a situation where he was going to experience the difficulties he did in flying missions, bombing missions over Europe or during World War II. So I just wanted to add those two comments. It's a good book, by the way. If anybody is interested, Scott Iman's written a whole series of books. John Wayne, John Ford, The Silent Era. There's a few others that are coming out here shortly. I think he has one that just came out for Christmas this year on Cary Grant.
My last remaining question. Is Bert a good cop?
Yeah,
He
well,
shoots into a crowd of people multiple times with clearly having terrible aim. He lets people off the hook and skirts responsibilities all over the place. He takes off during the middle of the day to go check on his wife. And
yeah,
finally,
well, we know what
he
that was
lets
about.
criminals escape so that because they punch him in the face.
Yeah, well, okay.
I mean, he's supposed to be a pillar of stability in this community, and yet he seems more bumbling than Barney Fife.
Maybe it's also a reflection of law enforcement in the 1940s. So, one last question. I read an article not too long ago about Chuck Lorre and the other creators of several TV shows. Roseanne.
Big Bang Theory.
Well, yes, and I was going to get to that, but Two and a Half Men and then The Big Bang Theory. This was their favorite film. Nick the bartender is played by a guy who went on to produce several films, working with Danny Thomas and with Desilu, I believe, by the name of Sheldon Leonard. Had been a regular cast member on Jack Benny's show through the late 30s and 40s. And Chuck Lorre named the characters in The Big Bang Theory after him.
He only said he took the movie because he needed money for baseball tickets.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, folks. So, final thoughts for the week.
It's been an interesting ride. We're coming down to the end of season 2.
This is the end of season 2.
Well, technically, we have the
The
recap.
recap's the start of season 3 as far as I'm concerned.
All right. I never thought we'd probably get this far, but thanks to you, you do all the engineering and all the heavy lifting. I'm more limited simply because of my responsibilities from work and such.
Yeah, you get the fun part. You get to watch the movie, come in, sit down, do the podcast, and leave.
Yeah, well, I also get to pay for certain other aspects of this, but that's
The
the kind of the
hats?
way. Huh?
The hats?
Yes. And I have a few ideas of things we're going to do, and there's plans of how we're going to expand the Ronnie Duncan studio in the future. And I hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas or a Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever your holiday is. It's
Festivus?
Festivus, yes, for the rest of us. Ultimately, it's all about family and love and understanding and appreciation of each other. And I have many stories of family gatherings that are earmarked by much less than love and togetherness. But I encourage everybody to take a moment and just stop and really appreciate what they have, because the last few weeks for me, both personally and professionally, because of some things well outside of my control, have been horror. I am so looking forward to being able to spend time together at Christmas, even though Tom's sister and my daughter is in basic. She decided to serve her country at this point in time and join the Navy Reserve, so she's in basic training. She will not be home for Christmas. I'll miss her, but her husband will be with us at least part of the time. And I just appreciate that aspect of my life much more. And I hope everyone else does too, and can find joy, peace, and love all around you in at the end of 2021 and heading into 2022. I never envisioned ever getting to the point where I'm starting to use years like 2022 as when I was a kid.
For my part of it, thank you for recognition of me, but thank you for being my co-host on all of this. It's a much different show to be able to talk with somebody and have a conversation as opposed to trying to do this exercise on my own. I really don't think anybody would care to listen to my random thoughts if it were just me. So, just from that standpoint, it's been fun. But the other thing I'll recognize, and it's something I've mentioned offhand, I doubt I've mentioned it on the show before, but I'm not even sure what to call him at this point, other than maybe entertainment and sports personality. Dan Lebitard, who used to be on ESPN, now he works on his own, made a comment a few years back that kind of stuck out to me. How appreciative he was at the time because he had been able to successfully do a television show program with his father for a number of years, and how much that meant to him that he was able to work with his dad for I don't know how many ever years that that show, I think it was highly questionable at the time, was on, and that most people don't get that opportunity. And in many ways, I have felt at times that my service when I was at your office, and part of the reason I resonate with George Bailey was is it felt somewhat self-sacrificing at times, and that part of it was for the betterment of the family business, and doing all of the things that were necessary to help prop people up. Eventually, I kind of told myself that you guys probably needed something beyond me or something different than me, and I was able to make some choices for myself, despite whatever you guys have told me in the past. But that being said, the first thing that I did was basically create this show as a catalyst to continue in some capacity working with you. And even though I can't understand where the last 2 years have gone, it seems both like it's been forever since the start of 2020 and that I have no idea where the time has gone. The only constant for the better portion of this part of my life, my 20s and now into my early 30s, has been working closely with you. And so I appreciate the time that I've had because realistically, I have no idea how long either of us is going to be here. But this show, as long as, it's able to be put out, is forever. It's out into the ether. There will always be a piece of each one of us for now 96 plus episodes that is out there for people's enjoyment, but also something that we could hold amongst ourselves for whatever reason if there was a need to remember the other. And so I just take the moment to appreciate what we've done and accomplished over 2 years. I think we were talking with Rob last week about it because he's a fellow podcaster, that very few podcasters ever get to this sort of episodes. And the fact that I almost have 2 shows that have gotten to this point of 100 episodes is incredibly significant to me. That the wherewithal to stick with it and to be able to take on this level of a schedule, work through it, and do all of the things to keep everything afloat where, like you mentioned, I do a lot of the stuff that's juggling, and I probably spend, 15 hours a week minimum trying to produce and do the work on one of these shows, let alone 2 of them. And so I just take an appreciation for my stick-to-itiveness and being able to see the other side and the benefits of my work, but also the labors of love that it's been, because we haven't, at least to this point, made a single dollar off of this show. And it really has never mattered to me that we needed to. It was always going to be something that was, I got to work and share a passion with my dad, and we got to talk about something that we were both interested in for as long as we got to do it. And so just thank you to anybody who's listening. Thank you to you. Thank you to just anybody that's been a part of the 2-year run of this. We certainly look forward to doing more shows next year. Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us and the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, as this is the last episode of Season 2, we will be doing our annual season recap of Season 2, and then looking forward to Season 3. You won't want to miss that one, so please make sure you are subscribed to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that more can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram or Twitter at GMotePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.